Gunfire shatters the evening calm as a gang of ruthless outlaws storms into Copper Creek, expecting easy prey, unaware they've awoken a sleeping legend. Meet Sam Kincaid, a quiet, unassuming stagecoach driver whose whispered past tells stories of bullets, bravery, and revenge. Once known as the pole-bearer, the West's deadliest gunfighter, Sam's fast draw makes Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday look slow. When the infamous Fletcher brothers ambush the town, planning to settle old scores, they quickly discover that Copper Creek isn't helpless. It's defended by ordinary folks turned heroes overnight, armed with shotguns, courage, and a fierce determination to protect their own. Will Sam's lightning-quick Colt and the town's grit turn the tables, or will the Fletcher gang write the final bloody chapter? Stick around for the heart-stopping conclusion, and be sure to subscribe. If you're a fan of John Wayne classics, Clint Eastwood toughness, and true American grit, this story is tailor-made for you. Elijah Silent Eli Stone had been many things in his life. A Union scout, a drifter, even a bounty hunter for a short stretch. But for the last 3 years, he'd worn the unassuming mantle of a stagecoach driver. Folks in Silver Bend, a small frontier settlement hugging the edges of a rolling prairie, knew him simply as the quiet fellow who guided a 6-horse Concord coach back and forth between their Redwood Stage outpost and distant Fort Roscoe. He was polite and dependable, rarely spoke above a hushed murmur, and never missed a day unless the entire region lay buried under snowdrifts or battered by storms so fierce they swept wagon wheels clean off their hubs. If people occasionally wondered about the scars beneath his leather duster or the old haunted look in his gray eyes, they never pried. After all, Elijah Stone was good with horses and good with people in his own silent way, and that was enough for Silver Bend. At least it had been enough for Georgia Glenn, who operated the Redwood Stage outpost with the efficiency of a seasoned rancher. She'd taken Eli on as a driver when he showed up 3 years prior, dusty and tight-lipped. Despite initial reservations, she'd recognized his competence from the start. He handled the big teams like an artist, steady, precise, never losing his temper when one of the horses bucked in fear or veered off course. And for a place as small and isolated as Silver Bend, stability was everything. Georgia appreciated reliability. Her outpost was the lifeblood of the region, after all. The stage delivered mail, medicines, travelers, supplies, and news from the outside world. She oversaw it all with her ledger in hand, ensuring the lines of communication and commerce remained unbroken. On this late summer afternoon, the whole world felt suspended in a golden hush. Long beams of sunlight slanted across the outpost yard, illuminating tiny dust motes in the air. The endless grasslands extended in every direction, tall blades swaying gently in the breeze. Eli, dressed in a worn canvas jacket and a hat that had seen better years, was crouched under the coach, checking a brake assembly. Few realized how particular stagecoaches could be, with complex springs and intricate hardware. The passenger compartments were built stout to endure rough terrain, but if a single bolt worked itself loose, it could mean catastrophe at the next rut or washout in the road. So as usual, Eli went about his inspection systematically. He paused once to run a hand over a faded scar on his forearm, a habit he never seemed aware of. From the porch, Georgia watched him. She knew when not to disturb him. He was most himself in these moments, quietly working, content. Finally, though, she called out, "Eli, you ought to give yourself a rest, maybe stay in tonight and have a decent supper." Her voice carried more concern than command, and she was marking figures in her ledger as she spoke. "You've been up since before dawn, harnessing and feeding those horses." Eli emerged from under the coach with a small smear of grease on his cheek. "I appreciate the thought, Miss Glenn," he replied in his soft, measured tone, "but I'm still making sure the coach is ready for the morning run. Got a new line of passengers heading to Fort Roscoe tomorrow." Georgia couldn't help a small smile. "And you think you'll find something else wrong with it if you check long enough?" He wiped his hands on a rag. "I'd rather know now than in the middle of Wolf Canyon," he said. "A man doesn't want to be stranded there at dusk with bandits or worse lurking." She nodded, conceding the point. She also knew that Doc Everett Rourke, who stood nearby reading a stack of mail, harbored his own private knowledge of Elijah Stone's past. Whatever secrets lay behind those scars and that quiet demeanor, Doc Rourke was privy to pieces of it, enough to treat injuries that normal men never encountered. Georgia could sense those undercurrents unspoken between the two men. She didn't press, though. Life out here in the frontier demanded respect for each person's boundaries, especially a man's private battles. Sheriff Lionel Hennessy arrived at the Redwood Stage outpost in a swirl of dust and worry carved into the lines of his face. He wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself with the calm authority of a law officer who'd seen more than his share of trouble. His eyes, a worn-out shade of blue, darted from Georgia on the porch to Doc Rourke by the hitching post, and finally to Eli as he finished checking the coach's undercarriage. The sheriff dismounted, tipping his hat in a greeting that felt half-rushed, then hitched his mare to the rail. "Afternoon, Ms. Glenn. Doc, Elijah," the sheriff said, his voice hushed but urgent. After receiving nods from all, he continued, "I've got some news from Brightwater. Word is, Lucas Grimm and his gang have been spotted in the area. They hit a bank in Clayton Springs last week. The marshals up north have been busy, but they can't be everywhere. Word is Grimm's gang might try heading this way." No sooner had he spoken than Elijah's eyes darkened. He didn't pause in his methodical chores. He just kept examining the next spring and bolt. But Georgia noticed that flicker of something primal, something reminiscent of storms about to break. She'd grown attuned to Eli's micro-expressions. His minimal movements betrayed more than he realized. And as always, Doc Rourke watched with that knowing gaze, as though he could see the old ghosts swirl behind Eli's eyes. Georgia took a breath. "Lucas Grimm, you say? I thought he mostly stayed north, near the border?" Sheriff Hennessy nodded. "He did until the marshals started sweeping that territory clean. Now he's pushing south, looking for easier pickings. Might be them or might be one of the Holbrook brothers riding with him. Reports vary, but in any case, they're a nasty bunch. If they show, expect trouble. They don't just rob, they make an example of whoever tries to resist." Doc Rourke finally spoke, folding his mail. "How many men are with Grimm?" "At least 5 or 6, Hennessy replied, glancing at Eli. "Grimm himself, the 2 Holbrook brothers, Mal and Clyde, Levi Pratt, and a young hothead named Toby Finch. Possibly more drifting in and out. They're a pack of wolves." George's cheeks paled. "Our bank here's just a small building. Barely anything to steal. Think they'll pass us by?" Hennessy exhaled, a heavy sound that told volumes. "That's the hope, but I'd bet they'll sniff around. They'll want provisions, supplies, maybe fresh horses. And if they're feeling mean, they might not care if we have no coin. They'll take out their frustration on anybody." Even from his half-kneeling position, Elijah spoke quietly. "It's 3 days to Fort Roscoe for a rider, maybe more if the weather turns. By the time we send for help, it might be too late." Hennessy nodded grimly. "Exactly. So best to keep watch. If I can get a deputy from somewhere, I'll try. But we're spread thin." He offered a forced smile. "You all stay safe, you hear?" Eli stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes fixed on the sheriff. "Then it's just us for now." "That's about right," Hennessy admitted. "We'll lock things down as best we can. Maybe it's all just rumor, but we can't afford to be complacent." Just then, an old fellow named Henry Teague, a retired cavalry scout turned local handyman, rose from a nearby bench, pocketing his knife and the wooden figurine he'd been whittling. "I'd best get on back to the livery, see to securing the stalls. Don't want no trouble for the horses." He tipped his hat toward Georgia. "Put anything I owe on the tab." With that, Henry ambled off, leaving behind a hush that seemed deeper, heavier. The earlier golden hush had transformed into a tension-laden silence. Even the horses in the corral seemed uneasy, stomping restlessly as though they sensed the shift. Georgia rubbed her palms on her skirt. "Well, that's enough to make me lose my appetite." Eli simply nodded, stepping off to place the harnesses in neat order. There was no bravado in him, no puffed chest or righteous talk. For the second time in a few minutes, Georgia thought she saw him touch an old scar, this time on the heel of his palm. As though muscle memory recalled a familiar shape, perhaps the butt of a revolver once held. It was a silent gesture, but it spoke volumes. Silver Bend was a place of subdued hopes and practical living, a scattering of wooden buildings, general store, saloon, blacksmiths, doctor's office, and a handful of homes, surrounded the Redwood Stage outpost. Pastures and farmland spread beyond, like the spokes of a wagon wheel. In times of trouble, townsfolk usually gathered at George's outpost or at Sheriff Hennessy's office, whichever felt safer. This particular evening, the outpost saw its usual few travelers, but word of Lucas Grimm's impending threat had quieted their mood significantly. Two traveling salesmen arrived, dusty and bedraggled, seeking food and a night's lodging. They carried a pall of worry, having glimpsed the aftermath of Grimm's atrocities in Clayton Springs. One of them, a graying man named Rutherford Sloan, nearly spilled his coffee as he recounted what they had seen. "They tied up the bank manager there," he said, his voice trembling. "Not just tied him, they beat him so viciously, his face was unrecognizable." His partner, a younger fellow named Finchley, stared into his own coffee cup as if searching for courage. "They carved warnings on the walls," Finchley added, his eyes darting about the outpost's modest common room. "Meant to scare folks into handing over valuables without a fight." "Sure." Georgia tried to keep their spirits up, offering them stew and bread. But the atmosphere had turned bleak. Even Henry Teague, who'd returned from the livery with more news, slumped at a table, chewing on the side of his lip. Sheriff Hennessy, for his part, took up a watchful post near the door, pipe smoke curling around his head. "If they come, we'll be ready," he said. But there was a tremor in his voice, the weight of an underfunded, undermanned lawman trying to reassure frightened travelers. Doc Rourke sat near a small lamp, reading through letters by flickering light. He glanced at Elijah, who had taken a seat at a far table, quietly sipping water. The doc remembered all too well how he'd encountered Eli 3 years prior, battered and feverish on the outskirts of town. No family, no one asking after him. The doc had stitched him up, nursed him back from a bullet wound that looked suspiciously like it came from a high-caliber revolver. Yet never once had Eli confessed how he'd been shot or by whom. Georgia tried to offer a semblance of normal routine. Fresh coffee, a warm meal, small talk about the next stage departure. Yet everything felt artificial, the hush of dread creeping back every time someone mentioned Lucas Grimm or the Holbrook brothers. A few uncertain jokes fluttered from Finchley, attempting to lighten the mood. "Well, at least the sheriff can keep us safe, right?" he said, raising his mug in a half-hearted toast. A strange scoff sounded from Eli's corner, nearly inaudible, but it reached the ears of everyone else in that hush. Finchley's cheeks reddened. "Something funny, driver?" he asked, a defensive edge creeping into his tone. Elijah calmly set his mug down. "Just thinking that if a man has to brag on how many he's killed, as Grimm does, it might be he's not as skilled as folks believe." Doc Rourke cleared his throat, trying to diffuse the tension. "Eli's not prone to idle chatter. He's just speaking what's on his mind." Finchley bristled. "I heard Grimm's got at least a dozen notches on his gun, maybe more. That's not something to scoff at." Eli's gaze was mild, though. "A man who feels compelled to keep a tally is either proud of it or terrified no one else will notice. Usually fear, not skill." His words hung in the air for a moment, unsettling Finchley, who had no retort prepared. Georgia stepped in quickly, telling Eli to check on the horses if he had a spare moment, effectively sending him away before more sparks flew. From across the room, Sheriff Hennessy watched Elijah depart. The faintest line of curiosity knitted the sheriff's brow. He'd always suspected Elijah Stone wasn't merely a capable driver. There was a tautness in the man's stance, like a coiled spring. Yet Hennessy, who prided himself on reading men, found Eli elusive. His instinct said, "This man has walked the darkest roads and survived." But he didn't press. Sometimes it was best to let sleeping dogs lie, until you needed them awake. It wasn't much later that a frantic ranch hand galloped into the outpost yard, horse frothing at the mouth, breath ragged with urgency. He nearly toppled from the saddle when he reined up too hard. Sheriff Hennessy sprang to his feet, and Georgia set down the ladle she'd been using to stir stew. Elijah, still outside, stepped forward, a steadying hand at the young man's elbow. "Easy now," Eli murmured. "Catch your breath." They're coming," Masha the ranch hand blurted, his face streaked with dust and sweat. "Lucas Grimm's gang. They just raided the Connors Ranch, only 2 hours' ride north, and burned buildings, shot at anybody who got in their way." A silence, brittle as glass, shattered around them. George's breath caught in her throat. Doc Rourke hurried onto the porch, trying to examine the panicked rider. But the man seemed too distressed to focus on anything but his message. They killed Mr. Connors, he managed. Rest of the family ran. It looked like the gang was heading this direction. Suddenly, tears brimmed in the young man's eyes. They hog-tied some of the ranch hands, left them half-beaten. In the ensuing moment, Elijah's jaw flexed imperceptibly. His gaze flitted once more to that old scar near the base of his thumb, a habit repeated whenever tension spiked. Sheriff Hennessy steadied the ranch hand, motioning for him to go inside. "Tell us everything, son. Then we'll figure out how to respond." Georgia clenched her fists. "They're that close." "Yes, ma'am," the ranch hand said, trembling. "Less than 2 hours out, I'd wager. Probably even closer if they push hard." Sheriff Hennessy strode inside, barking orders. "Everyone, pack up your valuables. If you can't fight, head to your homes and bar the doors. Keep a lantern off. Darkness might give you some cover." He paused, scanning the faces of the travelers and townspeople. "No one wander the streets. This is no game, folks." Four. Most began to scatter, urgency replacing their earlier hush. Georgia set aside her pot of stew, rummaging for the shotgun she kept under a counter. "Eli," she said gravely, "perhaps we should cancel tomorrow's stage run until we know how this is going to shake out." But Elijah Stone, usually so accommodating, shook his head. "Best to keep it on schedule." That puzzled Georgia. "But why?" He looked at her and his voice dropped even lower, almost an intimate hush. "Because if Grimm's gang thinks we're shutting down business, they'll sense our fear. They might act recklessly. Sometimes normal routines can mask our preparations." She regarded him in that pause, seeing something new in his eyes. An edge, a confidence that spoke of a man who had faced nightmares before. "Eli," she said softly, "are you sure you aren't in over your head?" His gaze shifted toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered in the dying light. "I've been over my head for years," he said, "but sometimes that's exactly where a man needs to be." He touched her arm in a gesture both reassuring and distant, then quietly moved to check the feed bags for the horses, as if war were not about to descend on their small settlement. Sheriff Hennessy, overhearing, swallowed his own concerns. He wasn't entirely certain what Elijah's background was, but some inner sense told him that if this man was resolved to face Lucas Grimm's gang, then Hennessy wouldn't stand in his way. Instead, maybe he would stand beside him, because even if Elijah Stone was no longer that man he might once have been, there was no doubt he had the skill set that matched the fury in those scars. By twilight, Silver Bend transformed into a place of hushed expectations. Lanterns flickered behind drawn shades, the night air bristling with an electric tension. A few men from nearby ranches had ridden in, offering their rifles and eyes for lookout duty. But no one was under any illusion. Lucas Grimm's gang was rumored to be well-armed and cruel. It would be no simple matter to drive them off if they arrived hungry for blood. Inside the Redwood Stage outpost, the atmosphere was grim. Sheriff Hennessy sat at one table, loading bullets into his revolver, each metallic click echoing in the silent space. A handful of travelers, a mother with 2 small children, the 2 traveling salesmen, the ranch hand who'd brought the warning, and Henry Teague, lingered near the outpost's main hearth, exchanging anxious whispers. The mother tried to soothe her children, who were fighting sleep in the face of adult dread. Elijah stood near a side window, parting the lace curtain slightly to scan the dark yard. He heard the wind rustling through the sparse trees, occasionally picking up dirt that swirled in miniature dust devils. Every sense in him felt heightened, attuned to the possibility of approaching hoofbeats. He could almost taste the adrenaline on the back of his tongue, and it brought back memories he'd tried to bury. Memories of other standoffs, other nights spent waiting for devils in human form to ride in, with guns blazing. Doc Rourke was the next to step inside, carrying his medical satchel. "I'll remain here," he said quietly, "in case anyone needs patching. If a fight breaks out, I won't be much help with a rifle, but I can bind wounds." Sheriff Hennessy glanced up. "I appreciate it, Doc. Just keep your head low if bullets start flying." Georgia, still determined to manage her outpost as though it were a typical night, tapped Elijah's shoulder. "Could you see to the lanterns outside, Eli? Make sure they're lit but turned low. Might discourage someone from sneaking up in total darkness." He nodded, stepping out onto the porch with a tin of oil and a cautious step. He passed Annie Westbrook, the local music teacher, who had just arrived with a small sheaf of papers. She'd been tutoring children earlier and only recently heard the warnings. Annie's bright auburn hair gleamed under the waning moonlight. "Should I stay or should I go?" she asked no one in particular, fear in her voice. "Stay inside," Elijah said gently, turning up one of the lanterns. "But keep to the back rooms if you can. If the gang sees movement, it may embolden them." So she slipped inside, clinging to those sheets of music as if they might serve as a shield from reality. Elijah, finishing with the porch lanterns, sensed a deeper darkness than the night itself. Storm clouds still skirted the horizon, an echo of the tension in his own mind. Every muscle in him was coiled. Sheriff Hennessy once said that a man who never truly sleeps is haunted by something. Elijah supposed that was true, for he'd seen enough in his earlier years to keep him from restful nights. This situation, this confrontation with Grimm's gang, threatened to unleash that old part of him that had once earned him a dangerous moniker across 3 territories. After returning inside, Elijah found a place near the door to stand watch. Hennessy caught his gaze. "If it comes to it, will you do what needs to be done?" the sheriff asked, voice low. Eli's expression was unreadable at first, but then he nodded. With that single motion, both men understood each other. No more needed to be said. As midnight approached, the travelers tried to rest, dozing where they could. The mother cradled her children in her lap. The salesmen huddled near each other, rifles in reach. Elijah remained a sentinel by the window, listening for the approach of distant horses. A small coterie of volunteer watchers outside kept vigil too, but the quiet did not break. It was as though the entire region held its breath for the bloodshed that might erupt. And so the town waited, locked in a tense stalemate with a threat not yet materialized but looming. Morning came with a raw sky, streaks of pink and gold fighting their way through lingering storm clouds. The Redwood Stage outpost stirred to life slowly, its occupants rubbing eyes still gritty from lack of sleep. Despite the tension, no sign of Lucas Grimm's gang had appeared overnight. That absence, far from reassuring everyone, amped up the sense of dread. Where were they? Had they diverted course, or were they circling like wolves for a more opportune moment? Georgia busied herself preparing coffee and biscuits, determined to maintain routine. The traveling salesmen emerged from their makeshift sleeping spots, stifling yawns as they found places at a table. Sheriff Hennessy paced near the window, glancing now and then at Elijah, who was outside watering the team of horses. A quiet question flickered in the sheriff's eyes. What next? In times of crisis, people look to men like Hennessy, and now, apparently to Elijah Stone. Eli finished distributing feed, pausing to pat the flank of the lead mare. He muttered a few soothing words, the same kind he'd used countless times over the last 3 years to calm anxious animals. Horses responded to steady hands and low voices. Humans often did too, but that was a lesson seldom heeded by the hot-headed. As he worked, his mind drifted to old regrets. He'd once sworn never to pick up the revolvers that had left him with blood-soaked memories. But here he stood, on the cusp of yet another gunfight. Sometimes it seemed the world would not let him bury that old life. By the time he returned to the outpost, Doc Rourke and Georgia had set out the coffee. Sheriff Hennessy approached, pointing to the open road. "We can't keep the stage grounded forever. Folks still need to travel, and some are expecting that run to Fort Roscoe." Georgia nodded. A cancellation might stir more panic. Then again, sending it out could put passengers at risk if Grimm's gang is still out there. Eli, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye, spoke quietly. "Let's keep it on schedule. If Grimm's men are set on trouble, they'll find us whether the coach departs or not. At least if we follow routine, we have some measure of control." He watched Georgia's expression shift from doubt to a hesitant agreement. She knew he was right. Routine could be a weapon, a semblance of normalcy that disguises readiness. It was then that Annie Westbrook emerged, holding a worn piece of sheet music. She offered a wistful smile. "Maybe a song will calm folks. I know we're on edge." Georgia nodded, thankful for any distraction. "That might help," she said. "Lift some spirits." And so Annie softly played on the outpost's small upright piano. A gentle tune, warm and haunting, threaded through the tense air. For a few minutes, travelers and residents alike let themselves be comforted by melody instead of fixating on potential horrors. But the reprieve shattered when a rider galloped in from the north, nearly colliding with the water trough. His face mirrored raw panic, skin ashen, eyes wide. "They hit the Terrence homestead an hour ago," he gasped, sliding off his horse. "Shot Mr. Terrence dead when he tried to protect his wife. They're heading here next, maybe half a dozen men or more." It took only seconds for panic to spread. The mother clutched her children tighter. The salesman went white. Sheriff Hennessy cursed under his breath while Doc Rourke quickly gathered his medical bag. People scattered, some running to hide, others seizing shotguns from behind the outpost counter. Elijah, calm amidst the storm, gently closed the piano's lid, stopping Annie's trembling tune. "Then we be ready," he said. Hennessy's eyes met his. "How many do you think?" "Grimm's main group is 5, Eli said, "but there could be stragglers or new recruits. Could be 8 or 9. Don't count on them being organized, but don't assume they're fools either. They'll sow chaos, pick off easy targets, break morale. Standard tactic for that breed of outlaw." "Tiwao." "Then we'll deny them that opportunity," Hennessy said, trying to sound confident, though worry edged his tone. "We fortify. We keep watch. And if they come, we hold." Georgia swallowed, stepping in. "We aren't set up for a long siege. The outpost is sturdy, but not a fortress." Eli nodded. "We won't need a long siege if we move decisively. They'll expect fear. Maybe we show them something else." He turned to the sheriff. "You ready to do what's necessary?" Hennessy opened his mouth to reply, but no words came at first. Finally, he said, "We stand, or we lose our town. Yeah, I'm ready." With that, they began preparations. Furniture was moved to reinforce windows. Rifles were loaded and vantage points chosen. Some on the outpost roof, some from the stable's hayloft, a few behind crates in the yard. If chaos was the outlaws' plan, Elijah Stone intended to answer it with methodical calm. Despite all the precautions, the sun climbed high and no outlaws appeared, leaving the townspeople more anxious than relieved. People posted at windows felt their nerves fray. A hush blanketed the entire area, as though the slightest noise might trigger an explosive confrontation. By midday, tension strung everyone tight, yet no dust cloud on the horizon, no gunshots, no hollering outlaws. Sheriff Hennessy muttered that perhaps they'd changed routes or decided the pickings in Silver Bend weren't worth the trouble. But Elijah, glancing at the faint storm clouds gathered near the horizon, said, "They might just be waiting for the right moment. Storm or dusk, both create confusion. Let's not relax yet." His words proved prescient. Late in the afternoon, the familiar rumble of many hooves reached their ears. Distant at first, then building into a thunderous echo that sent hearts pounding. It came from the western approach, near a rocky outcrop half a mile from town. Sheriff Hennessy stationed men with rifles in second-story windows, scanning the terrain. Elijah took up a position behind a reinforced crate stack across the yard from the Redwood Stage outpost, revolver in hand. Oddly, the riders didn't charge in. Instead, they stopped just out of rifle range, forming a line of silhouettes against the dying sunlight. There appeared to be 6 or 7 of them. Could be more in the rear, hidden by dust. Their posturing was deliberate, sending a message. We are here, and we have time. Nerves crackled like static. A rancher in a second-story window cursed under his breath. Henry Teague, crouched behind a trough, asked, "Should we take a warning shot?" Elijah shook his head from across the yard. No. The outlaws wanted them to fire first, to reveal positions. They would wait. Minutes turned into a standoff. People shifted in discomfort, rifles growing heavier in sweaty palms. The horses of the outlaw group whinnied and pawed at the ground, but the riders made no sudden moves. As the golden sky slowly bled toward twilight, a single rider broke from the group. He approached, waving a white rag that might have been a torn bandana. Immediately, Sheriff Hennessy tensed, worried it was a trick. Eli signaled for no one to shoot unless threatened. The rider came within shouting distance, reined in, and called out. His voice carried a mocking civility. "Anybody in that outpost willing to talk terms?" Sheriff Hennessy leaned over the porch railing. "You with Lucas Grimm?" A laugh. "He's near enough. Name's Clyde Holbrook. We hear you folks in Silver Bend might want to save yourselves a heap of trouble." Even from a distance, Eli could see the man's confident posture. No slump or sign of fear. This was a man who believed he held the upper hand. "How so?" Hennessy returned, stalling for time. Clyde motioned over his shoulder with the white rag. Lucas Grimm doesn't fancy unnecessary bloodshed. You pay a little toll, say, open your bank, your store, whatever valuables you've got, and we don't burn this place to the ground. Everyone lives. Georgia, peeking from behind the door, spat under her breath. Listen to that gall. Hennessy glanced at Elijah. They exchanged a look. Then the sheriff called out again. We're not in the habit of surrendering to extortion. Clyde's grin seemed to widen, though it was a sinister shape in the fading light. Suit yourselves. You've got 1 hour to reconsider. Then we come and take what we want, old-fashioned style. With that, Clyde turned his horse and cantered back to the line of waiting outlaws. Sheriff Hennessy exhaled, tension in his shoulders. 1 hour? Elijah nodded. They want to give us time to think, or maybe panic. Could be part of their intimidation. They'll expect fear, people scattering, maybe deserting you. The question is whether we use that hour well. Doc Rourke from inside said, we can't fight them head on. There's only a handful of us armed properly. They'll tear us apart if they charge in force. Henry Teague tapped the side of his old cavalry rifle. We might take a few with us, though. A quiet resolve settled over them. An hour until doomsday, Georgia asked a trembling question. Eli, is there nothing else we can do? We can't just hand over everything. Let them walk away with it. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the outlaws in the distance, silhouettes against the swirling dust. They won't walk away. Men like Grimm never leave witnesses who can testify against them. They'd cut us down anyway, just for sport. No point negotiating with devils. Pausing, he drew a slow breath. We make a stand. We use the environment, the buildings, every vantage point. And if an opening comes to break their line, we take it. In that moment, Sheriff Hennessy saw in Elijah a quiet but dangerous competence. It was like a door opening briefly, revealing a man shaped by violence. And for the first time, he understood that Elijah's brand of lethal calm might be exactly what they needed in this hour. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky with streaks of fiery orange, the townsfolk of Silver Bend prepared for the longest hour of their lives. Sheriff Hennessy coordinated watchers at second-story windows, armed them with rifles or shotguns. Doc Rourke stationed himself at the Redwood Stage Outpost's main lobby, setting up a makeshift infirmary with bandages, laudanum, and whatever tools he might need to deal with bullet wounds. Georgia stayed there too, ensuring any non-combatants, like the frightened mother and her children, remained safely behind reinforced walls. Annie Westbrook, the music teacher, huddled with them, though her eyes flicked restlessly to the small piano in the corner, as if music might quell the storm of fear. She was too rattled to play again, though. Outside, Elijah and Henry Teague examined cover positions in the yard. They turned crates, barrels, and wagons into barricades, forming a rough line of defense in front of the outpost. If the outlaws charged, they'd have to brave a gauntlet of gunfire. The plan was simple: funnel them into an area where the defenders held the advantage. Sheriff Hennessy joined them, face drawn. They're biding their time. Could be they're positioning men around the town's perimeter. That was a possibility. Grimm's crew might try to encircle them, cut off retreat. Elijah nodded thoughtfully, stooping to pick up a coil of rope. He asked Henry to help him rig a tripwire along an alley beside the outpost. 2 small barrels would topple with a crash if anyone snuck through in the dark, serving as both alarm and minor obstacle. When all was set, Hennessy glanced at his pocket watch. About 15 minutes left, he muttered, dread coloring his voice. A hush fell over them like a funeral shroud. People said their quiet prayers, or simply stared into the distance, minds racing with images of blood and ruin. The tension was so thick it weighed on every heartbeat. For Elijah, the hush before gunfire was something he knew intimately, like the final stillness before a flash flood. He recalled the day, years ago, when he decided he wouldn't live by the gun anymore. He had burned the clothes he once wore as a feared enforcer across 3 territories. They'd called him the pall-bound rider, or simply the mourner, for reasons he never liked to discuss. The monikers had drifted across saloons and dusty roads, whispered in tones of both awe and dread. He'd left it all behind, or so he believed. Yet here he was. The past, it seemed, was not finished with him. The final minutes dragged. Then as the sun kissed the horizon, a chilling sound split the air. A single gunshot. It came from the Outlaws' distant line, as though heralding the end of negotiations. Sheriff Hennessy, from behind a crate, whispered, "They're starting." Sure enough, figures on horseback began moving forward. The group was less orderly now, but their silhouettes multiplied. 8, maybe 10 riders? The dust cloud obscured their exact number. Among them, a figure in a wide-brimmed hat who could only be Lucas Grimm. The infamous leader carried a rifle across his saddle, posture relaxed. He was known for letting his underlings stir up chaos first, stepping in for the kill at his convenience. Georgia, peeking through the outpost window, clenched her teeth. "They're more than we expected," she murmured, voice trembling. The mother with children stifled a sob. Even the traveling salesmen readied their own modest firearms. Everyone braced for the coming storm of violence. Elijah Stone stood at the outer barricade, hat pulled low, one hand resting on the butt of a revolver at his hip. He felt every nerve thrumming. He hadn't drawn a gun in earnest in 3 years. Could he still do it? Could he face a half-dozen or more outlaws bent on murder? The memory of that old moniker whispered in his mind again. The mourner. He pushed it aside. The hour of peace had ended. The time for action was now. They came swiftly, hooves pounding like hammer blows on the cracked earth. A half-dozen riders fanned out, aiming to flank the Redwood stage outpost. Another group thundered straight at the barricades. Sheriff Hennessy's chosen riflemen in second-story windows opened fire first, the bark of gunshots erupting in a violent thunder. Plumes of smoke and dust filled the air. Elijah crouched behind a stack of crates, heart in his throat but mind sharpening to a razor's edge. "Steady," he told himself. "Focus on what you can control." One of the riders, presumably Clyde Holbrook, let out a war whoop. His horse leapt a water trough, but that placed him in direct line of fire from a rancher perched in the general store's upper window. A shot rang out, and Clyde's horse went down, screaming. Clyde tumbled across the dusty ground, losing his rifle. He scrambled for cover behind a broken fence. Meanwhile, a second rider took aim at the general store window, only to be dissuaded by a hail of bullets from behind the outpost porch. The defenders were holding strong. Elijah peered around the crate stack, eyes scanning for the biggest threat. He spotted Levi Pratt, an outlaw known for his skill with a repeater, dismounting near the hitching post. Levi was methodical, using the post and some barrels as makeshift cover while returning fire. Another man, a younger figure Elijah identified as Toby Finch, rushed toward the side of the outpost, presumably trying to break in and flank the defenders. Toby tripped the wire Elijah and Henry had set, sending 2 small barrels clattering and alerting them to his presence. Before Toby could regain composure, Sheriff Hennessy emerged from behind a half door, revolver blasting. Toby dropped his firearm, shrieking from a bullet graze in his shoulder. A volley of shots whizzed around Elijah's position, splintering wood and stirring dust. He returned fire, his old instincts burning through every movement. One shot hammered into an outlaw's thigh, toppling the man from his horse. Another bullet shattered the rifle stock of a second adversary, the outlaws cursing in confusion. More dust, more heat. The smell of gunpowder thickened the air. This was the savage heartbeat of a frontier skirmish, and the quiet stage driver had stepped into it like a man greeting an old unwelcome friend. Inside the outpost, Doc Rourke braced for the wounded. Georgia stood by his side, armed with a shotgun but shaking. Annie Westbrook helped calm the terrified mother and her children. Occasionally, a bullet would thud into the outpost walls, eliciting gasps and a scramble to keep everyone down. Through the windows, they witnessed the swirling chaos outside. Suddenly, a thunderous yell rose from the main street. Lucas Grimm himself charged in, brandishing his rifle from horseback, black coat flapping in the wind like a crow's wings. He fired into a second-story window, forcing a rancher to duck away from the opening. Sheriff Hennessy tried to shoot back, but Grimm angled his horse expertly, weaving among the scattered wagons. In those brief glimpses, Elijah saw the man's face, a mix of arrogance and cold fury. The story spoke true. Lucas Grimm radiated that lethal confidence of a man who'd taken many lives. Before Elijah could re-aim, a single shot rang out from behind a crate to the left. Clyde Holbrook again. The bullet ripped into the crate near Elijah's head, a near miss. Eli spun, returning fire. His shot caught Clyde's arm, drawing a yowl of pain. The outlaw dropped behind cover, cursing a blistering streak. The tide seemed to be shifting in the defenders' favor. The outlaws hadn't anticipated such coordinated resistance. They'd believed fear would do most of the work. Instead, they found a town braced for battle. Yet it wasn't over. Levi Pratt, wounded but still mobile, circled around the stable, flanking Henry Teague. A muzzle flash preceded a sharp crack. Henry staggered, hit in the side. Seeing it happen, Elijah's composure nearly cracked. Rage flared. Henry, a kindly old scout, collapsed behind the trough. He'd been like a father figure for some in town, always offering a helpful hand. Elijah leapt over debris to cover Henry's spot, firing off 2 quick shots at Levi. One bullet clipped the outlaw's hat, another ricocheted off metal. Levi ducked and ran for safer ground. Amid all this, overshadowed by swirling dust and black powder smoke, the question grew in Elijah's mind. Are we truly winning, or just prolonging the inevitable? The outlaws were battered, but not broken. Lucas Grimm was still out there, prowling with lethal cunning. The Redwood Stage outpost defenders had gained an edge, yet the final verdict remained unwritten. In the chaos, the mother inside the outpost let out a cry as a stray bullet shattered a windowpane. Shards rained onto the floor, cutting her arm. Georgia helped Doc Rourke yank the mother and children farther away from the line of fire. Outside, Annie Westbrook crouched behind an overturned piano bench. She had tried to retrieve some sheet music to calm her nerves, only to be pinned down by gunshots. Behind them, from inside, came a rasping cough. Lucas Grimm again, or perhaps another wounded man. Elijah felt the weight of that final confrontation. He had shot to stop Grimm's rampage, not to kill him outright. Some said letting a snake live was foolish, but Elijah hadn't wanted to spill more blood than absolutely necessary. That was the difference, he told himself, between the man he used to be and the man he hoped to become. Dawn arrived sluggishly, the sky marbled with pale blues and muted pinks. Sheriff Hennessy readied his horse while a weary hush clung to the outpost yard. The wind carried the scent of drying blood and gunpowder residue. Although a few ranchers dozed upright, cradling their rifles, most of the defenders were still too keyed up to sleep. Clyde Holbrook and the other captured outlaws lay slumped in makeshift restraints, glaring or dozing with heads lolling. The silence after a gun battle was almost as unnerving as the fight itself. Elijah helped Hennessy mount, mindful of how drained the sheriff looked. "Keep an eye open for stragglers," Elijah advised quietly. "There were a few outlaws who rode off. We don't know if they'll regroup." Hennessy nodded. "I'll be quick as I can at the telegraph. Might need to ride further to a neighboring station if the lines are down." He paused, looking Elijah in the eye. "You sure you'll be all right here?" "I will," Elijah said, though inside he felt the weight of the entire town leaning on his shoulders. With that, the sheriff clicked his tongue, and the horse cantered away from the Redwood Stage outpost yard, heading for the telegraph office on the far side of Silver Bend. Elijah turned back to the battered scene. By the wagon corral, Georgia Glenn and Annie Westbrook were dispensing what remained of fresh water to the men who'd fought through the night. Doc Rourke hustled between Henry Teague and Lucas Grimm, trying to keep them both alive until real medical help could arrive. Henry's breathing was shallow but steady. Grimm, though feverish, refused to slip into unconsciousness, as though sheer stubborn will kept him alert. As Elijah approached, Grimm's dark eyes flickered to him. "So, Stone," he rasped, voice husky from pain. "When the big law dogs arrive, you expect them to believe you're just the local driver? They'll want you to testify. Hell, they might lock you up themselves if they dig around your past." Elijah folded his arms, face impassive. "No interest in dredging up the past. You and your men attacked. The folks here defended themselves. That's all the law needs to know." A bitter laugh escaped Grimm's cracked lips. "Ever the saint, huh?" His gaze traveled the room, landing on Annie Westbrook's anxious face, on Georgia pacing with her shotgun, on the mother tending her still frightened children. "If you kill me, they'd name a street after you. But you left me breathing." Doc Rourke stepped in, brandishing a bottle of laudanum. "That's enough talk, unless you want me to skip the painkiller." Grimm clamped his jaw, scowling. He might be a ruthless bandit, but even he had a threshold for agony. With reluctance, he took a few sips, the tension draining from his expression slightly as the drug seeped in. Annie approached Elijah, biting her lip. "What if his men come back?" she whispered, glancing anxiously at the door. "Or another gang hears about this. Or the Holbrook brothers plan revenge. Or—" Elijah placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll face whatever comes. For now, we've won this fight." She nodded, trying to calm her shaking hands. "I keep thinking, if you hadn't been here—" He shook his head, cutting her off gently. "No, we stood together. Sheriff Hennessy, Georgia, Henry, all of you. This town fought back. I was just part of it." Yet even as he spoke, a pang of uncertainty churned in his gut. Was it truly over, or had this fight merely rattled the cage of old enemies and old ghosts? In his experience, once blood was spilled, men with vendettas crawled out of every crevice. He glanced over at Clyde Holbrook, who glowered like a wolf denied a kill. Toby Finch, younger and wounded, brooded with unblinking intensity. The seeds of vengeance were sown in men like these. There was no doubt about that. While Doc Rourke continued tending the wounded, Elijah oversaw the process of binding and relocating the less injured outlaws. They herded Clyde Holbrook, Toby Finch, and Levi Pratt into a cramped storeroom adjacent to the stable, locking them under guard by 2 ranchers. The outlaws carried themselves with sullen contempt, but they were outnumbered, their guns confiscated. Elijah paused at the threshold. "Don't try breaking out," he warned quietly. "We've got rifles and shotguns on every corner. If you make a move, they'll shoot first, no questions asked." Clyde Holbrook spat at the ground. "I'd sooner rot than grovel to a bunch of cowhands." Levi Pratt gave a curt nod, as if acknowledging the logic of surrender, while Toby Finch just stared daggers. For now they were contained, though Elijah knew far too well how cunning cornered men could be. He posted a second guard around back, ensuring no one slipped out a window. Returning to the outpost, he found Georgia Glenn in her office, rummaging through ledgers and supply manifests. She looked up, dark circles under her eyes. "Thought I'd see if any supply wagons are due soon," she explained wearily. "We're running low on bandages, coffee, flour, everything." Her voice trembled on that last word, betraying how much strain she was under. Elijah stepped closer. "We'll get you restocked once the telegraph goes out. Fort Roscoe should send help, maybe a relief detail. This place can't handle all the wounded for long." Georgia swallowed hard, arms wrapped around herself. "I know, it's just all this violence. I didn't sign up for living in a war zone." Elijah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You run the stage outpost that keeps this region alive. You're the reason many folks get their mail, their medicines, their news. That's no small thing, Georgia." She managed a faint, grateful smile. "Thanks, Eli. Don't know how you keep so calm." "Believe me, I'm not calm inside, but I've been through this kind of storm before." A moment of silence pressed between them until the abrupt clatter of hooves outside drew their attention. The pair hurried to the doorway. They found a dust-coated rider, one of Hennessy's volunteer deputies, reining in a lathered horse in front of the outpost. "There's movement near the foothill," he called. "Saw at least 3 riders skirting the ridge. Could be more of Grimm's men." George's face blanched. "Don't tell me we're due for a second wave." Elijah frowned. "Could be just scouts, or drifters who heard the gunshots and want to avoid trouble. We need better reconnaissance." The deputy nodded, still catching his breath. "I'll get a few men to ride that way, see if we can chase them off, or find out if they're part of Grimm's bunch." Within minutes, 6 ranchers and volunteers had mounted up. Elijah, though desperate for more information, chose to stay. Henry Teague needed attention. The outlaws needed guarding. He told the departing riders to be cautious, to avoid any traps. As the dust cleared from the departing posse, Elijah turned back inside. The outpost's main room still functioned like a hospital ward, with Doc Rourke checking on Lucas Grimm, who dozed fitfully under the effects of laudanum. Henry was stable for now, but his skin glistened with fever. Elijah's chest ached at the thought that this kindly old scout, who used to whittle wooden toys for the local children, might die from some worthless outlaw's bullet. Worse yet, Elijah felt a growing certainty. The fight with Lucas Grimm's gang, brutal as it was, might only be the prelude. Men like Clyde Holbrook didn't bow easily, and vengeance had a way of breeding bigger threats. He had a sense that the quiet was merely an intermission before another storm. A few hours crept by in slow motion, suspense weaving into every breath. Doc Rourke caught an hour or two of sleep while Georgia and Annie Westbrook took over minor wound dressing duties. The telegraph lines near the far edge of town proved functional as Sheriff Hennessy's messenger returned with a short note from the operator. Message sent to Fort Roscoe, awaiting reply. Lucas Grimm remained unconscious for the most part, roused occasionally by the burning in his wounded arm and side. Doc Rourke surmised the bullet had lodged in muscle, avoiding major organs. By mid-afternoon, a pall of fatigue hung over the outpost. People slumped where they could find a seat, dozing lightly but never fully drifting off. Elijah Stone leaned against a window frame, scanning the dusty street. A few volunteers had reestablished a semblance of normalcy, tidying debris, clearing spent shells, retrieving personal belongings scattered in the chaos. Two battered salesmen, Rutherford, Sloan, and Finchley, offered to help, if only to distract themselves from reliving the previous night's terror. They collected stray bullet casings and stacked them on the outpost porch like bizarre souvenirs. Inside, Toby Finch fussed with the bandage on his hand. "This is too tight," he complained to a rancher-turned-guard. "Doc said it'd help slow the bleeding," the guard replied stonily. Toby shot him a venomous glare. Levy Pratt sat in the corner, silent, staring at the floor with a twitchy frown. Clyde Holbrook, meanwhile, studied Elijah with predatory curiosity every time the stage driver came in. That silent standoff spoke volumes. Holbrook blamed Elijah for their downfall. Suddenly, the sound of approaching horses pricked everyone's ears. 3 riders, dust-covered, pounded into the yard. The lead horseman was one of those who had gone scouting the foothills. He swung off his horse, nearly stumbling. "Found 'em," he gasped. "Or at least found signs that more outlaws are out there. Didn't see them directly, but we spotted multiple sets of fresh tracks. Might be they're regrouping." Elijah felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Could be they're waiting for nightfall," he said under his breath. "They'll want to rescue their leader or take revenge." Georgia, standing by the porch, closed her eyes briefly. "Lord, haven't we had enough?" Exchanging a look with the scouts, Elijah decided on caution. "We should consolidate. Bring everyone who can fight back here. Post watchers with rifles on the rooftops. If they come, we can't be spread too thin." So it was done. Over the next hour, the volunteers who had gone scouting trickled in, reporting glimpses of strange silhouettes on distant ridges. Some swore they heard echoing gunshots in the hills. Sheriff Hennessy hadn't yet returned with official word from Fort Roscoe. The sense of siege returned, heavier than before. The outpost braced itself a second time, wounded and tired, but not broken. In the midst of preparing defenses, Elijah took a moment to check on Henry Teague, who lay delirious. Doc Rourke sponged the feverish man's forehead. Henry's eyes fluttered open, catching Elijah's. "Son," he rasped, voice tight with pain. "They might come again. You got to see this through. Protect them all." Elijah's throat constricted. "I will, Henry. You just hold on." "Used to think you were just a drifter," Henry said, managing a weak grin. "Didn't know you had a lion's heart, or maybe a demon's aim." Elijah gently clasped the old man's hand. "Sometimes it takes trouble to reveal the truth, I suppose." Henry nodded faintly, then slipped back into uneasy sleep. In that moment, Elijah realized the entire fight was no longer about outrunning his past. It was about preserving a future for these people who had slowly become his community. For 3 years, he had lived among them in near silence, driving the stage, repairing wagons. Now, by circumstance or fate, he stood as a bulwark against the evils of men like Lucas Grimm. By early evening, the sun sank low, painting the horizon in dusky purples and reds, an unsettlingly beautiful backdrop for the tension gripping Silver Bend. Sheriff Hennessy finally returned, riding in with a stiff posture that spoke of urgency. His face set in grim lines, he swung off his horse and handed Elijah Stone a crumpled telegram slip. Elijah scanned the brief message. "Fort Roscoe Dispatch. Marshal en route with detachment. Arrival in 2 days. Hold prisoners. Resist further aggression." 2 days, Elijah muttered. "We can't just fold up shop for 2 days if there's a second wave out there." Hennessy tucked his gloves into his belt. "We've got no choice. We hold or we run, and if we run, we leave the wounded and the town to them. That's not an option. Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of those words. All right, then we prepare for another siege. At that, Sheriff Hennessy sighed. Wish I had better news, but that's it. When doesn't it out on Saturday was he said or thinking he should know or will he has a link to you and not Kelly the word and take a comment is the and to put out for be foreign that might not he un par ma bien med bray a lay murder see and tare is telling and jump up it's the same amount penis fat hana gay no we're offering it then Levy Pratt paced in the storeroom, ear pressed against the thin boards to overhear talk of a second wave. Clyde Holbrook drew the guard's ire by demanding water, though ultimately the guard relented, not wanting to be accused of inhumanity. Toby Finch just sulked in the corner, the bandage on his hand stained with dried blood. Lucas Grimm, still in Doc Rourke's care, awakened enough to question the doc about what was happening. He wore a mocking grin when he heard the rumors of more outlaws prowling the foothills. They'll come for me, he whispered, wincing at the pain in his side. You can't keep me locked up forever, Doc. Doc Rourke's mouth pressed into a tight line. I'm just trying to keep you alive until the marshal arrives. Save your threats. Grimm groaned, but his eyes shone with dark glee. He seemed almost eager for the fight to continue, as though another storm would validate his worldview that raw violence was always the answer. Meanwhile, Elijah and Hennessy set about reinforcing the outpost perimeter once again. They posted watchers on the roof, with an improvised alarm system of empty tin cans strung together to jangle if a sentry spotted movement. They triple-checked their ammunition. Every capable adult, men and women alike, had a weapon within reach. The travelers, like Rutherford, Sloan, and Finchley, kept low profiles, although they stayed armed with battered pistols. Annie Westbrook stationed herself with Georgia, vowing to reload spent cartridges if it came to another protracted shootout. Despite the fear gnawing at everyone, a resolute determination filled the air. People helped each other with small tasks, shared stoic smiles, and offered a comforting hand on a shoulder or an encouraging word. If anything, the brutality of the prior battle had forged a stronger sense of unity. Elijah, noticing this camaraderie, felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the best in human nature emerged when evil knocked at the door. Still, as the stars blinked into existence overhead, he found himself pacing once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that the next assault, if it came, would be crueler, more coordinated. Men with vengeance in their hearts rarely let an injured ringleader lie in captivity without retribution. He peered out beyond the yard, seeing only shadows and the hint of ridges in the faint moonlight. An hour slipped by, then another, with no sign of trouble. Some watchers let their eyes droop, but Elijah couldn't rest. Instead, he recalled Henry Teague's plea. Protect them all. He intended to, no matter the cost. A tense lull settled over Silver Bend, eerily reminiscent of the silence before the first battle. Midnight came and went with no sign of movement in the hills. Exhausted watchers took turns napping in shifts, though few truly slept soundly. In the main room where Lucas Grimm lay bandaged, one rancher kept vigil with a shotgun across his lap. Doc Rourke dozed in a chair, leaning forward with arms folded. The hush was almost a tangible presence, weighing down every breath. In the early hours of morning, Elijah Stone found himself outside by the corral, checking on the stagecoach horses. Moonlight traced the gentle contours of their flanks, and they shifted nervously under his hand. Animals often sensed tension, and these horses had witnessed the raw chaos of gunfire and frantic shouting not long ago. He offered soothing murmurs, patting each one. Easy now, he whispered, giving them lumps of sugar from his pocket. As he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shape slipping through the gloom near the stable. He froze, heart pounding. Another shape darted behind a stack of hay bales. Elijah edged toward the barn door, footsteps silent. A single lantern hung on a nail inside, its weak glow creating shifting shadows. He pressed himself against the wooden boards, hearing faint breathing, then a soft voice. We have to do this quietly. Another answered, Hurry up before that damn driver notices. Elijah recognized the second voice. Levi Pratt. The outlaws were attempting an escape. He gritted his teeth, stepping carefully around the stable corner. Sure enough, Toby Finch and Levi Pratt knelt by a window that overlooked the storeroom where Clyde Holbrook was locked up. Finch's bound hand fumbled with a metal file or some makeshift tool, trying to pry the latch. Elijah raised his revolver. Don't move, he said in a low, lethal tone. Finch let out a gasp and stumbled backward. Levi Pratt froze, hands up. We're just... You're trying to bust Clyde out, Elijah finished, eyes narrowing. You're already in enough trouble. Don't make this worse. But Toby Finch had no intention of giving up. Desperation lit his face. He lunged for Elijah, swinging a piece of scrap metal. Elijah sidestepped, bringing the butt of his revolver down on Toby's wrist. The outlaw cried out, dropping his improvised weapon. Pratt, perhaps wiser, merely sank to his knees. Within moments, 3 ranchers who'd heard the commotion rushed in, rifles at the ready. A breathless hush followed. The ranchers glared at the outlaws, who glowered right back. Trying to escape? One rancher spat. That's a hanging offense if the marshal decides so. Toby Finch nursed his bruised wrist, cursing under his breath. Levi Pratt, eyes flicking between them, said nothing. He looked ashamed, but defiant. In short order, they were marched back into the storeroom, forcibly separated from Clyde Holbrook. Some old horse tack was used to strengthen their bonds. Holbrook, hearing the scuffle, sneered through the barred window. Took you long enough, he muttered. Elijah stepped closer. You want out of here so bad, Clyde? I can just toss you all into the desert and let you fend for yourselves. Holbrook's lip curled. We'd still do better than any gutless townsfolk. Elijah pressed a hand on the window ledge, leaning in. Those gutless townsfolk beat you. Remember that? Holbrook's jaw worked, but no sound emerged. Finally, he muttered a curse and turned away. The newly thwarted escape attempt only deepened the tension. If the outlaws were willing to risk sneaking around with severe injuries, it meant they might try anything, even coordinating with allies in the hills. Stepping out into the open air again, Elijah looked at the sky, which was starting to lighten into pre-dawn. He felt a mixture of triumph and weariness. The crisis was far from over, but he would see this through, just as Henry Teague had pleaded. Because Elijah Stone, or whoever he had once been, wasn't running anymore. Dawn broke on the second day after the battle with Lucas Grimm's gang, casting uncertain light over a weary Silver Bend. Rest had been scarce. Anxious watchers patrolled the outpost yard through the night, and Elijah Stone hadn't managed more than a brief doze in the corner of Georgia Glenn's office. Outside, the sky rolled out in layers of pale yellow and soft blue, revealing a town still littered with the remnants of gunfire. Splintered crates, spent cartridges, dried streaks of blood on packed dirt. Doc Everett Rourke emerged first, stepping onto the Redwood Stage outpost porch with bleary eyes. The physician had dozed off only once in the night, while tending both neighbors and enemies alike. Henry Teague remained his primary concern, lying unconscious with a fever that refused to break. Lucas Grimm, meanwhile, hovered in that murky realm between delirium and grudging lucidity, occasionally demanding water or grimacing at anyone within range. For all his bluster, he could do little more than press a hand to his bandaged side and curse under his breath. Sheriff Lionel Hennessy arrived from his early rounds, adjusting the brim of his hat as he dismounted. In the stable yard, a handful of ranchers rose from piles of hay or blankets on the ground, stiff from sleeping against rough boards. At every turn, Elijah Stone noticed the pinched lines of fatigue in people's faces. Their eyes told of fear that still hadn't receded. Yet no second wave of raiders had come in the night. No fresh skirmishes or rescue attempts by Grimm's scattered men. Anything? Elijah asked Hennessy as the sheriff joined him near a half-toppled hitching post. The lawman shook his head. Riders scouted the ridge at first light. They found tracks leading away into a box canyon, but no sign of a gathering force. It's like they just vanished. That might be good news, Elijah allowed, though his tone remained cautious. He couldn't discount the possibility of a trap. Georgia Glenn joined them, her shotgun cradled in her arms, hair disheveled from a night spent dozing at the outpost desk. Do we need to keep everything on high alert? She asked, voice subdued. People's nerves are shot. They want to open the store, check on homes, maybe see to livestock. Elijah sighed, scanning the battered main street. A mother led two children by the hand. The kids stared wide-eyed at bullet holes in the outpost walls. A rancher hammered boards over a shattered window. The traveling salesman, Rutherford, Sloan, and Finchley, helped gather scattered crates, their suits stained with dust they might never wash out. "We can't stay locked down forever," he admitted, "but we should keep watchers on the outskirts until the marshal arrives." Hennessy nodded. 2 days, they said. The sheriff's mouth twisted in mild frustration. "Feels like an eternity. But we hold out, keep watch. My guess is any stragglers from Grimm's gang are long gone, or they'd have tried something by now." Their plan gradually came together, a partial reopening of Silver Bend. The general store and blacksmiths would serve customers, but armed volunteers would remain posted around the Redwood Stage outpost. The captured outlaws, Clyde Holbrook, Toby Finch, Levi Pratt, and 2 more who were wounded but stable, remained locked in makeshift cells under the stable's storeroom. Lucas Grimm stayed under Doc Rourke's watchful eye, still guarded by at least 2 armed men at all hours. Though some sense of normalcy returned to the dusty streets, a subdued gloom clung to every conversation. Folk wondered if the worst had passed or if an even greater violence lurked in the wings. Every so often, Elijah heard someone mutter that Grimm's downfall would spawn bigger devils, old rivals wanting to claim territory, or relatives of the Holbrook clan thirsting for payback. He quietly reminded them that none of that mattered until the marshal arrived to haul the outlaws away. Still, Elijah's own anxieties lingered. He'd promised Henry Teague he'd protect these people, and he meant it. His old vow, to never again live by the gun, had cracked. Now he carried not just a revolver at his hip, but the burden of final responsibility. And from the corner of his eye, he caught occasional glimpses of Clyde Holbrook's savage stare through a slit in the storeroom door, like a wolf studying a wounded deer. By midday, Doc Rourke hastily summoned Elijah and Sheriff Hennessy inside. They found him crouched over Henry Teague, whose feverish form stirred restlessly on a makeshift cot in the main room. Annie Westbrook hovered anxiously, trying to dab sweat from Henry's forehead with a clean cloth. The older man's breathing had grown shallow and ragged, and a dark red stain on his bandages suggested fresh bleeding. "I need to remove that bullet," Rourke said gravely, motioning for Hennessy to assist. "And I don't have a fraction of the supplies I need. If it stays lodged, infection will kill him." Elijah's throat tightened. "Is there anything we can do? Maybe the traveling salesman brought medical goods?" Rourke shook his head, rummaging through his bag. "I've scrounged all I can. We're low on antiseptics, morphine, everything. If I can't get the bullet out cleanly, or if we don't stop the infection, he won't last another night." "Eddie," Georgia Glenn rushed in at that moment, carrying a battered wooden box. "I found these bandages in the stable storage. They're old, but maybe they'll help." She handed them over, eyes darting from Henry's pale face to Elijah's troubled expression. "We'll do what we can," Doc said, voice pinched with urgency. "Annie, heat water. Sheriff, you might have to hold him down. Elijah, you can help sanitize these tools." They sprang into action, orchestrating a desperate attempt at battlefield surgery. The traveling salesman offered to boil water on the outpost stove, while Georgia fetched strips of linen. Through it all, Henry mumbled incoherently, occasionally calling for a friend or loved one from his past. The illusions of delirium. Elijah took a moment to clasp Henry's hand, forcing calm into his voice. "Hang on, Henry. We're not losing you." The procedure began with a lull in the day's usual clamor. Hennessy pinned Henry's shoulders, and Doc Rourke administered what scant laudanum and whiskey they had to dull the agony. Even so, the old scout thrashed when Rourke probed the wound. Annie stayed near his head, whispering soothing nonsense. Georgia, grim-faced, hovered with fresh linens. Elijah felt his stomach twist as Doc extracted the fragment of lead with shaky precision. The spurt of dark blood made him curse under his breath. How many times had he seen life seep away on a dusty floor like this? Henry let out a ragged moan, then shuddered. Rourke quickly packed and bandaged the wound with trembling hands. "That's all I can do," he declared, voice strained. "Either he fights off infection, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Annie whispered a desperate prayer under her breath, tears brimming. Georgia squeezed her shoulder. Sheriff Hennessy, releasing Henry's arms, exhaled sharply and stood. Blood smeared his sleeves. "I'll send a rider to the next town for more medical supplies," he said. "The marshal's men might have a proper doctor among them, but waiting 2 days might be too long." Elijah laid a hand gently on Henry's brow. The fever still burned, but at least the bullet was out. If fate allowed, maybe the old man would pull through. "Thanks, Doc," he murmured. Rourke nodded stiffly, wiping sweat from his own brow. His eyes flicked to the corner where Lucas Grimm lay. The outlaw leader watched the procedure with eerie fascination, as though dissecting the scene for a future retelling. Elijah met Grimm's gaze, but neither man spoke. The silence between them seemed to say enough. One man fighting to save a friend, another man content to watch from the sidelines of his captivity. Outside, a horse neighed as a rancher prepared to depart for the neighboring settlement, hopefully to find medical supplies. And so the day churned on, minute by agonizing minute, with Henry Teague's life hanging in the balance, and the battered outpost bracing for whatever might come next. Mid-afternoon heat weighed down on Silver Bend, turning the stable yard into a shimmering, dust-laden enclosure. Elijah Stone secured a new guard rotation for the captive outlaws, mindful of their earlier escape attempt. With Clyde Holbrook, Toby Finch, and Levi Pratt growing restless, it would take only a moment's lapse in vigilance for them to exploit a weakness. Indeed, when Elijah stepped into the storeroom, he found Clyde glaring at the deputy in charge. "How long we got a squad here?" he demanded. "Might as well feed us something before we starve." The deputy, a rancher named Ward, glanced at Elijah, uncertain. Elijah nodded curtly. "Bring them some bread and water. They're still prisoners, but we're not savages." Holbrook's sneer might have been mistaken for gratitude if not for the malice in his eyes. "You're a better man than your lawman, friend," he said, voice laced with sarcasm. "He'd sooner see us all rot." Elijah ignored the barb. Toby Finch was sitting in the corner, fiddling with the bandage on his shot hand. Levi Pratt paced, face drawn. None of them looked ready for another fight. Their injuries and exhaustion told. Still, cornered wolves could lash out unpredictably. Elijah wasn't taking chances. He stepped outside, nearly colliding with Annie Westbrook, who carried a small basket of bread. "Oh," she gasped, "I didn't realize you were, I thought these men needed something to eat." Her nervousness testified to how alien this situation was for her, feeding dangerous criminals. Yet her kindness prevailed. "Thank you," Elijah said quietly. "Ward'll take it in. Don't go inside with them. It's not safe." She nodded, handing off the basket. "I just hate thinking of anyone starving, even outlaws. But they scare me, Eli. The way they look at us." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Stay clear and don't worry. We'll handle them." They walked together back toward the outpost, Annie's gaze drifting to the battered building where Henry Teague fought for his life. "Any change?" "Doc says he's stable for now, but the fever's not dropping." Elijah's brow furrowed. "We can only hope the bullet removal helps." Annie's lips tightened. "He's strong-willed. If anyone can survive, it's Henry." In the outpost main room, Lucas Grimm dozed in a restless half-sleep, occasionally twitching in pain. Doc Rourke sat at a table, sorting the last of his medical supplies. Georgia Glenn paced near a window, glancing out every few minutes as if expecting a fresh band of raiders. The mother from earlier, a woman named Elaine Draper, had ventured to the general store to check on supplies for her children, leaving them in Annie's brief care. Sheriff Hennessy was outside, conferring with a newly returned rider. The man reported no sign of major activity in the surrounding hills, though rumors from traveling traders hinted that a few of Grimm's cronies might lurk near the canyons, uncertain whether to mount a rescue or flee the territory outright. "That's something at least," Hennessy muttered. "Better them hiding than gunning for us." Even so, the day pressed on with a sense of edgy anticipation. Every hour counted until the marshal arrived. Every minute seemed an invitation for trouble. Elijah felt those hours like a countdown, each one heavier than the last. He returned inside to find Henry Teague stirring feebly, lips parting in a hushed moan. Doc Rourke leaned in, listening. Henry's eyes slid open a crack, searching for someone. Elijah moved closer, gently clasping the old man's hand. "I'm here, Henry," he said, voice tight with emotion. "We're safe for now. You just focus on getting better." Henry's parched lips formed a word. "Thanks." Then his eyes drifted shut again. It was a flicker of hope, though faint. Elijah swallowed the ache in his throat. For Henry, for all these townspeople, he would keep vigilant. They deserved better than living at the mercy of vicious outlaws. As dusk approached on that second day, a hushed fervor took hold in Silver Bend. Residents cautiously emerged from their homes or hiding places. The local blacksmith reopened his forge to repair bent rifle barrels and hammered-up shutters. Georgia Glenn's Redwood Stage outpost functioned as the nerve center, receiving short visits from townsfolk anxious to confirm the outlaws were still locked up. Some brought extra food or blankets, laying them at the outpost steps as offerings of gratitude. Sheriff Hennessy organized a communal meal, served in the outpost yard with whatever provisions people could spare: beans, cornbread, dried strips of beef. Though simple, it was enough to lift morale. The traveling salesman clapped Rutherford Sloan on the shoulder, remarking that it might be the most memorable supper they'd ever have. Despite lingering fear, a camaraderie sparked around the hastily built cooking fire. Even folks who'd never spoken much before shared stories or offered faint smiles. Elijah Stone ate little, mostly standing guard while the others huddled near the warmth. A few watchers took positions on rooftops, scanning the darkening horizon. The stable storeroom housing Clyde Holbrook and his cohorts was locked tight. Armed ranchers sat just outside, exchanging quiet banter that masked their unease. "Eli," Georgia called, "take a break. I'll keep an eye on that door." He gave a short nod, stepping over to the cooking fire. Sheriff Hennessy handed him a tin plate of beans, one brow raised. "You look dead on your feet, Stone." "I'm all right," Elijah replied, though he felt the fatigue in every muscle. His thoughts dwelled on Henry Teague's fragile condition, on the indefinite wait for the marshal's arrival, on the possibility that Grimm's allies still lurked in the wilderness. Hennessy sighed, lowering his voice. "You've done more for this town than anyone could ask. Folks are starting to talk like you're some kind of frontier guardian angel." Elijah shook his head. "I'm no angel, just a man who doesn't want to see decent people terrorized." "We're grateful," Hennessy said, his eyes flicking to the watchers on the roof. "I just hope we can hold everything together until the marshal arrives." That sentiment was echoed by nearly everyone who tasted the meager meal. They wanted the outlaws gone, Lucas Grimm especially. Doc Rourke had done all he could to keep Grimm from bleeding out, which meant the notorious bandit leader remained stable. Stable enough to stare down any fool who tried to speak to him. Some whispered it would be simpler to let him die. Others insisted on lawful justice. The debate simmered beneath every conversation, unspoken yet potent. As the meal finished and folks began clearing dishes, Annie Westbrook approached Elijah with a shy smile. "Sometimes a bit of music helps. I thought I might play something on that upright piano inside. Calm nerves." Elijah's eyes softened. "That might be good, though be careful not to startle the watchers." Annie nodded. "I'll play something soft." She slipped into the outpost, a quiet figure in the lamplight, while outside the last embers of day gave way to star-speckled darkness. Sheriff Hennessy resumed his pacing. Georgia Glenn sorted through her ledger, trying to glean comfort from routine tasks. Elijah, finishing his meager supper, drifted around the perimeter, checking vantage points and offering a nod of encouragement to each watchman. The hush of night settled in, broken only by the occasional low murmur of conversation or the rustle of the windmill. For the first time in 2 days, the tension felt a fraction lighter, as if the town exhaled collectively. Maybe they'd survive without another ambush. Maybe, just maybe, they'd come through. But as Elijah rounded the corner of the stable, his intuition prickled. In the dim glow of a distant lantern, he saw a figure shift along the fence. He froze, heart thumping, hand moving instinctively to his revolver. Another shape, even darker, slithered behind a wagon. The watchers on the roof were scanning other directions, missing these intruders. How many were creeping toward the outpost? Elijah crouched, adrenaline spiking. This was no random passerby. It had the feel of a stealthy assault. He signaled to a rancher near the stable door. The man nodded, hefting his rifle. A second man joined them, reading the alarm in Elijah's eyes. Just like that, the hush shattered. A pistol flashed from behind the wagon, muzzle flare lighting up a masked face. Bullets hissed past Elijah's shoulder. Shouts rang out. So the second wave had come, after all. Just when Silver Bend dared to hope it wouldn't, chaos ignited once again. That single pistol shot was a starting gun, sending watchers scrambling to vantage points and ranchers rushing for cover. Elijah Stone dove behind a feed trough, adrenaline roaring in his veins. Another muzzle flash erupted in the darkness, the bullet splintering wood inches from his head. He called out, "Incoming on the south side, stable yard!" Immediately, shouts and footsteps thundered around him. A rifle cracked from the outpost roof, sending a bullet whistling into the gloom. In the flicker of muzzle flashes, Elijah glimpsed half a dozen figures creeping around the fence line, faces obscured by bandanas. At least two more crouched behind a broken wagon. Their stealth approach had ended, replaced by a flurry of gunfire. Within moments, the Redwood Stage outpost interior became a flurry of activity. Doc Rourke snatched up his bag and pressed himself flat against a wall, shielding Henry Teague and Lucas Grimm. Annie Westbrook, mid-phrase on the piano, jolted so violently her stool toppled. Georgia Glenn ducked behind the counter, shotgun in hand, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in her own ears. Outside, Sheriff Hennessy barreled into the yard, returning fire at the shadowy assailants. "Who are these devils?" he roared, ducking a shot that tore through the brim of his hat. A rancher next to him managed a shot that took down one bandit behind the wagon, the figure crumpling with a shriek. Elijah popped up from behind the trough, revolver barking twice. Another outlaw shouted in pain, stumbling away. Then a fresh salvo of shots peppered the yard, chipping wood and sending sparks across the corral fence. The air turned acrid with burnt powder. At the stable storeroom, a deputy and two ranchers guarded Clyde Holbrook and the others. Alarmed by the gunfire, Holbrook pressed his face to a window slit, eyes gleaming. "I knew they'd come," he muttered, grin wild. "I told you, my boys don't leave me behind." But to the deputy's ear, it didn't sound like Holbrook's voice carried relief, rather a vicious satisfaction, as if a long-awaited reckoning had arrived. A swirl of dust and confusion consumed the yard. Elijah reloaded while belly-crawling to a new position behind a water barrel. One of the watchers on the roof above him unleashed a rifle round that forced another attacker to dive for cover. For a moment, it seemed they had the advantage, forcing the intruders' heads down. Then came a shrill whistle from the far side of the yard, near the alley. More figures, possibly four, surged from the shadows, flanking the defenders. Gunshots flashed in rapid succession. A rancher collapsed with a choked cry, shot in the chest. Another ducked behind a stack of crates, returning fire blindly. Sheriff Hennessy realized the tactic. They were being pinched from two sides, attackers having split up to divide the watcher's focus. Gritting his teeth, he pivoted to direct defenders to the alley. "Cover the flank!" he bellowed, trying to organize the chaos. Elijah, hearing the new wave from the alley, whipped around. He sprinted across open ground, bullets zipping past like angry hornets. Reaching a battered wagon, he crouched behind its wheel. The flickering lantern light revealed an outlaw creeping forward, rifle at his hip. Elijah fired at the man's legs and the figure yelped, toppling in a tangle of limbs. Another attacker behind him retaliated, a shot that grazed Elijah's forearm. Pain flared, but he gritted his teeth and fired back, driving the outlaw behind a stack of lumber. In the swirling haze, he heard a piercing scream. Georgia Glenn's voice. Heart hammering, Elijah cast a frantic glance toward the outpost porch. A man had vaulted onto the wooden steps, brandishing a shotgun. Georgia's own weapon wavered, caught in that instant of terror as she faced the intruder at close range. Elijah had no shot from his angle, and she looked trapped. All around them, it was a nightmare replay of the first fight, only more frenzied. Fewer defenders were fresh. Many were exhausted or wounded. These new attackers fought with ruthless coordination, as if they'd planned this carefully. And in the center of it all, Elijah Stone realized he couldn't be everywhere at once. But he'd die trying to protect those who depended on him. Georgia Glenn's terror sliced through the din as the masked intruder lunged onto the outpost porch. She stumbled backward, her shotgun raised, but fear paralyzed her trigger finger. The man sneered behind his bandana, pumping his own shotgun to fire. In that frozen instant, it was as though she stared at her own fate. Suddenly, a side door slammed open, and Annie Westbrook emerged, brandishing a revolver she'd taken from a wounded rancher inside. Her face was ashen with fear, hands trembling, but she pulled the trigger. The bullet caught the intruder's shoulder, spinning him off balance. He grunted and fired reflexively, sending buckshot into the ceiling rather than Georgia. The muzzle blast shattered lamps, raining sparks across the porch. Seizing her chance, Georgia overcame her paralysis. She shoved the barrel of her shotgun into the man's midsection and squeezed both triggers. The deafening roar lit the porch in orange fire. The outlaw slammed against the railing, eyes wide, then collapsed in a heap. Georgia stood there, breath ragged, her weapon smoking. Annie stared, equally stunned, the revolver shaking in her grip. Inside, Doc Rourke shielded Henry Teague and Lucas Grimm from flying debris as windows shattered under stray bullets. A frantic mother, Elaine Draper, huddled with her children behind an overturned table. The outpost interior seemed like a storm-lashed cabin, every new shot and impact rocking the structure. Outside, Elijah Stone realized the defenders were spread too thin. He glimpsed Toby Finch and Levi Pratt inside the storeroom window, banging on the door as if hoping their rescuers would free them. Clyde Holbrook was nowhere to be seen at his window, which sent a chill down Elijah's spine. Could Holbrook's men have orchestrated this entire surprise to bust them out? He pressed forward, firing at a pair of outlaws who advanced behind the stable. One dropped, clutching his side. The other ducked out of sight. A bullet hissed past Elijah's ear, forcing him to flatten against the stable wall. In a quick glance around the yard, he counted at least 8 or 9 attackers total. They were losing some, but more remained unseen, using the gloom to their advantage. Sheriff Hennessy, pinned near the alley, hollered for help as 2 outlaws closed on his position. He managed a desperate shot that sent one reeling, but the other sprang forward, brandishing a Bowie knife. In the flicker of light, Hennessy's face paled. Before the outlaw could strike, a rifle barked from the rooftop. The knifeman jerked, then toppled. One of the watchers had landed a perfect shot, saving the sheriff by inches. Elijah exhaled a shaky breath. This was carnage on a scale the town couldn't sustain. They had to break the attacker's momentum. Half lunging toward a broken wagon wheel, he retrieved a small, improvised explosive, a canister of black powder some ranchers had rigged for clearing stumps. He'd stashed it earlier, just in case. Lighting the fuse with a trembling hand, Elijah hurled it toward the wagon behind which 2 outlaws huddled. "Down!" he shouted, ducking behind crates. A thunderous boom shook the yard, followed by a spray of dirt and splinters. Flames danced briefly around the wagon's broken remains. The outlaws there were either blasted back or scrambled for new cover, howling in alarm. That explosive shift rattled the attackers, providing a moment's reprieve. Still, gunfire crackled from multiple angles. Elijah's gaze darted to the storeroom. If Holbrook's men managed to breach that door, the outlaws inside might join the fight. Then everything would collapse. Blood pounding in his ears, Elijah crouched near the stable door, reloading with steady hands. He'd walked away from countless gunfights in a previous life, but now the stakes cut deeper. This wasn't about bounty or vengeance. This was about protecting the people who'd accepted him as a friend, even if they never fully knew his past. The hopelessness weighed on him, yet he refused to yield. He would stand until his last bullet, if need be. The explosion's echo still reverberated when Elijah dashed to the storeroom's rear corner. A door at the back offered a potential entry or exit point for any would-be rescuers. Sure enough, he spotted movement there. A burly figure prying at the hinges with a crowbar, presumably aiming to free Clyde Holbrook and his men. Creeping closer, Elijah fired a warning shot. "Drop it!" he barked. The man whirled, pistol half drawn, but Elijah's second shot grazed his hand, forcing him to drop the crowbar. He reeled back with a yelp, stumbling into a second outlaw who promptly returned fire. The bullet tore through the storeroom's flimsy wall. Inside, Levi Pratt and Toby Finch took cover, flattening themselves against the opposite wall. Clyde Holbrook pressed his face to a gap, eyes glittering with anticipation as the rescue attempt turned frantic. "You idiots!" Holbrook snapped. "Get the lock, not the hinges." But the outlaws outside had bigger problems. Elijah advanced with unnerving calm, systematically laying down fire that kept them off balance. One attacker tried flanking him from a corner of the stable, but a rancher's rifle from the rooftop barked, forcing the outlaw to dive for the ground. Another, pinned by Elijah's steady aim, cursed and retreated behind a rain barrel. From the yard's opposite side, Sheriff Hennessy and several defenders pushed forward, rallying around the stumps of burning debris from Elijah's black powder bomb. Shouts and scattered gunfire told Elijah that at least half of the attackers had either been killed, wounded, or forced to retreat. The wave was faltering, but not yet broken. A sudden lull gripped the immediate area near the storeroom door. A single figure emerged from behind a stack of planks, raising both hands halfway in a sign of uncertainty. "Wait! Wait!" the outlaw hissed, bandana slipping to reveal a younger face, sweat-streaked and panicked. "We didn't sign on for a bloodbath like this." Elijah kept him in his sights, finger light on the trigger. "You rode in shooting. What did you expect?" The young man swallowed hard. Clyde Holbrook told us we'd get an easy score, break out some buddies, run the place over. Didn't know you had half the town armed like an army." "Drop your gun, lie face down," Elijah commanded. The outlaw hesitated, fear and confusion dancing in his eyes, then complied, gingerly placing a revolver on the ground and flattening himself. Elijah called out to a rancher standing guard near the stable corner. "Secure him. Watch for more." Despite this small success, danger crackled in the air. Another volley of shots erupted from the center of the yard, where two outlaws tried to lay down covering fire for the men near the storeroom. Hennessy's group pinned them with accurate rifle blasts. A moment later, the outlaws collapsed, either dead or grievously wounded, their moans chilling the yard. In the span of a few minutes, the attack lost its momentum. Realizing they were outmatched, what remained of the second wave scattered into the shadows, hooves pounding if they still had horses, or sprinting on foot if not. Occasional gunshots chased them across the open plain, but darkness soon swallowed them up. As the final echoes of combat faded, Elijah Stone stood rigid, revolver still clenched in his hand. The yard was littered with fresh bodies and debris, the acrid smell of burnt powder mingling with dust. A lantern from the outpost porch revealed Georgia Glenn and Annie Westbrook stumbling outside, assessing the aftermath with wide eyes. Doc Rourke emerged too, staying low. It was over. This wave, at least. Elijah's heart still hammered in his chest, and blood trickled down his grazed forearm. Yet compared to the day of Grimm's arrival, the defenders had responded swiftly and decisively. They'd contained the threat, though not without cost. 2 ranchers lay wounded, one badly. Hurrying to the storeroom door, Elijah found the 2 outlaws who tried to break in lying prone, one clutching a bullet wound in the thigh, the other hissing through clenched teeth from a hand injury. Clyde Holbrook's fury burned in his expression as he realized the rescue attempt had failed. Toby Finch and Levi Pratt looked equally grim. "You're done," Elijah told Holbrook, voice tight. "Call off the rest. There's no winning here." Holbrook spat through the gap. "You think this is finished, driver? Mark my words, I'll see you dead." Elijah's eyes narrowed, ignoring the painful throb in his arm. "We'll see who lasts till the marshal arrives," he replied quietly, stepping away. All around them, townspeople gathered to assess casualties, tend to the wounded, and begin the grim task of removing bodies. The second assault had come and gone, like a sudden squall. Whether it was truly the last of Grimm's scattered allies or just another wave, no one could say. But for now, the Redwood Stage outpost stood defiant, scarred by bullet holes and soaked with blood, yet unbroken. In the aftermath, Sheriff Hennessy and Elijah Stone quickly reorganized the defenses, fearing another strike might follow. They doubled the guard on the storeroom, moving the newly captured intruders alongside Clyde Holbrook and his men. Now the place was cramped with half a dozen surly outlaws, some whining about injuries or lack of water. A rancher hammered extra boards across the window to prevent further contact from outside. Georgia Glenn took stock of the fresh damage, noting 2 bullet-riddled wagons, more shattered windows, and part of the outpost's railing blown apart by stray buckshot. Her hands shook as she wrote in her ledger, but she forced herself to keep a record, perhaps for the marshal's official report. Doc Rourke worked tirelessly again, patching those defenders wounded in the second fight. One rancher had a bullet lodged near his collarbone, another carried shrapnel from the improvised explosive. Grimly, Rourke nodded toward Elijah's arm, which glistened with dried blood near a deep groove. "Let me see that." Elijah, half numb with fatigue and pain, followed the doc to a bench. He winced as Rourke peeled back his shredded sleeve and swabbed the wound with carbolic solution. "You're lucky," Rourke mumbled. Just a nasty graze. Another inch to the left, you'd be in worse shape. Seems I'm always dancing with luck, Elijah murmured. How's Henry? Rourke's mouth formed a thin line. He's still hanging on, but I'm worried. The commotion can't be helping. If we don't get serious medical support soon... He trailed off, voice laden with helplessness. Elijah's jaw tightened. We're so close. Another day, maybe less, the marshal will be here. They'll bring a proper field surgeon, I hope. Doc nodded, pressing a fresh bandage to Elijah's arm. We can only hope. Nearby, Lucas Grimm gazed across the room from his makeshift cot, expression inscrutable. The second assault had caused him to stir, but with his wound and Doc's sedation, he hadn't joined in or tried to escape. Instead, he seemed to relish watching the chaos. Now he stared at Elijah, and once their eyes locked, Grimm's thin smile emerged. What? Elijah snapped, more harshly than intended. Grimm shrugged, wincing from the motion. Just admiring your resilience, driver. You put down 2 raids in as many days. Reminds me of a legend I once heard. Some unstoppable gunslinger who laid men in shallow graves. Shame you're wasting those talents playing nursemaid to this backwater. Elijah's pulse quickened, old memories threatening to surface. I'm not that man, he said quietly. No? Grimm's smile carried an edge of mocking disbelief. I can feel the kill in you, Stone. It's there. Sooner or later, it catches up with men like us. Ask Clyde Holbrook. He knows about vendettas. You can't outrun your nature. Before Elijah could retort, Doc Rourke intervened, shooting Grimm a glare. You're overdue for some laudanum, Grimm. Why don't you mind your own wounds? With a soft chuckle, Grimm subsided, though the look he gave Elijah promised more hateful insight than any wounded man should muster. Outside, Annie Westbrook gently played a few chords on the shattered upright piano, ignoring the missing keys. The notes came out broken, but they offered a tentative solace amid the tension. A few townspeople paused to listen, tears in their eyes. Even in the face of repeated violence, they clung to small acts of humanity. Sheriff Hennessy approached Elijah once the doc finished bandaging. Riders scouted the area again. Looks like the attackers who survived are long gone, probably limping away to nurse wounds. Guess we won this round too. Elijah nodded. Barely. We lost more good folks in the process. I'm tired of burying people. Hennessy's gaze dropped. He too was heartsick at the toll. But there was no alternative. Surrender to men like Grimm or Holbrook would have meant slaughter. They'd done what they had to do. One more day, Hennessy said. If the marshal shows, we can start putting this behind us. Elijah didn't voice the dark thought pressing his mind. What if the marshal never arrives? He simply patted Hennessy's shoulder. We'll hold on as long as it takes. Paragraph 9, approximately 620 words. The third sunrise dawned over Silver Bend with bruised clouds and a stiff breeze, kicking dust along the main street. Survivors of 2 battles now held a silent vigil for those who hadn't made it through. The stench of death lingered. A makeshift wagon carried away the bodies of outlaws and fallen defenders alike, bound for simple burials. Nobody found comfort in distinguishing friend from foe at that moment. Grief seemed to overshadow everything. Despite the sorrow, a ripple of anticipation sparked through the outpost just after midday, when a distant figure emerged from the north, followed by several more. Through telescopes or squinted eyes, watchers exclaimed that a small column of riders approached. Could it be the marshal and his men at last? Sheriff Hennessy and Elijah Stone stood side by side near the battered porch, hearts pounding with mingled hope and caution. As the group neared, it became clear they wore official uniforms, or at least badges glinting in the sun. Marshal Jedediah Kent led the procession, a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair beneath a weathered hat. 6 deputies flanked him, each armed and carrying the alert posture of lawmen on frontier duty. Behind them trailed a wagon laden with crates, possibly supplies or shackles. Hennessy breathed a visible sigh of relief. Finally. Eddie? Elijah nodded, tension loosening from his shoulders. The battered redwood stage outpost, riddled with bullet holes, had become a testament to the desperate stand the townsfolk had made. Now maybe they could pass the burden to official hands. Marshal Kent dismounted in the yard, his gaze sweeping the scene. Shattered planks, bandaged defenders, and the exhausted lines etched into every face. Heard you folks had a rough time, he said in a resonant baritone, tipping his hat to the sheriff. Name's Kent, out of Fort Roscoe. Got your telegram. Looks worse than I expected. That's putting it mildly, Hennessy muttered. I'm Sheriff Lionel Hennessy. This is Elijah Stone, our stage driver, and the reason we're still standing. Kent offered Elijah a keen look. Heard there was some fella holding off multiple raids. Must be you. Elijah inclined his head. Not alone. The whole town fought. Well, let's see what we've got. Kent gestured for his deputies to fan out. They'd arrived prepared. Sets of manacles, a travel cage for dangerous prisoners, even a small medical wagon manned by a young army medic. Immediately, the medic was directed to Henry Teague, prompting a flurry of renewed hope among the townsfolk. Within an hour, the marshal's team secured the captive outlaws, Clyde Holbrook, Toby Finch, Levi Pratt, and the rest. Lucas Grimm was moved with great caution, strapped to a stretcher. He glowered but lacked the strength for protest. At one point, he tried to sneer at Elijah. I told you, driver, you can't escape your past. But Elijah merely helped load him into the wagon, ensuring those shackles were tight. Some of the lawmen recognized Grimm, cursing under their breath at the bounty that might be on his head. We'll take him back to Fort Roscoe for trial, Kent said, along with the rest. Might even be federal charges, seeing how many murders they've racked up. Your testimony will be needed. Hennessy's gaze slid to Elijah, who stiffened slightly. Reliving the fights in court might draw out Elijah's own secrets, but they owed it to the fallen and the wounded. We'll cooperate, the sheriff answered for both of them. Marshal Kent's medic discovered Henry Teague in dire straits, but still clinging to life. The bullet removal had bought time. With proper care, the man might yet recover. They loaded him into a separate wagon, promising to rush him to advanced medical facilities at Fort Roscoe. Doc Rourke assisted, packing Henry's meager personal effects. A hush fell as townsfolk gathered to watch Henry depart, each whispering private prayers or good wishes. Annie Westbrook gripped Elijah's hand, eyes brimming with relief. He'll live, won't he? Elijah attempted a reassuring nod. We've done all we can. Now it's up to them, and Henry's own will. With the outlaws accounted for, Marshal Kent gathered a preliminary account of events. Sheriff Hennessy, Georgia Glenn, and Elijah Stone relayed the details. How Lucas Grimm first threatened the town, how the second wave attacked, how they managed to hold the Redwood stage outpost. Deputies took notes, shook their heads at the audacity of criminals. Finally, Kent turned to Elijah. I'm told you kept these folks from being overrun, Mr. Stone. Care to elaborate on how a simple stage driver managed that? A quiet settled. Elijah exchanged a look with Hennessy. The sheriff nodded, silently assuring him it was safe to speak. Elijah drew a breath, carefully choosing words. I've seen trouble before, Marshal. Learned a few things about how men fight. Just use those lessons to defend my home. Kent studied him, clearly sensing the larger story beneath. But he merely said, Well, you have my thanks. The territory needs men willing to stand up for what's right. Elijah only nodded. For once, no one pressed further about his past. Perhaps the bullet holes, bodies, and raw courage and evidence said enough. Relief wafted through Silver Bend as the marshal's men departed with their grim cargo. The wagon wheels rattled along the dusty road, bearing Lucas Grimm and his allies toward the justice they had long evaded. Riding alongside them, Henry Teague lay in the medic's care, his fate uncertain but buoyed by better resources. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of the outpost yard to watch the caravan recede under the midday sun, an almost surreal sight after days of violence. In the stillness that followed, Elijah Stone stood with Georgia Glenn, Doc Rourke, Annie Westbrook, and Sheriff Hennessy. One by one, they turned to face the Redwood stage outpost. The building showed scars of battle, splintered siding, windows shot out, scorch marks from Elijah's improvised explosive. Yet it remained standing, a testament to the community's resilience. It's over, Georgia whispered, tears moistening her lashes. Is it truly over? Hennessy exhaled. It is, for now. Grimm's men won't try again, not after losing so many and seeing a full marshal detachment haul him off. We can rebuild, bury our dead, and try to move on. Annie rubbed her arms as if a sudden chill swept by. Nothing will be the same, though. The nightmares, the memories. Her voice wavered. Elijah gently touched her shoulder. But you stood strong, Annie. You saved George's life on that porch. Remember that part, too. She offered a shaky smile, glancing at Georgia, who gave a grateful nod. The events of the last few days had forged unbreakable bonds between these neighbors, weaving them closer than any quiet year of routine could have. Doc Rourke cleared his throat, weary but relieved. I'll stay here for a bit, help mend any lingering wounds. No shortage of patience. People got bruised up or grazed in ways they haven't even noticed yet, given the adrenaline. Elijah nodded, eyes drifting to the battered yard. I'll do whatever I can to help fix the damage. Repairs, manual labor. And well, if folks would rather I left town. Georgia stared at him in disbelief. Left town? Elijah, you saved us. Why on earth would you go? He hesitated, an old fear tugging at him. Because men like Lucas Grimm keep crawling out of the shadows looking for a fight. And if I'm around, Hennessy shook his head firmly. We've survived precisely because you were around. If there's trouble, we'll face it together. A hush passed among them. It was as if the entire town silently echoed that sentiment. He belongs here. In 3 years of quiet stage driving, Elijah had never fully embraced Silver Bend as home. Always at arm's length. But in these last few days, a deeper connection formed. No longer just a man with hidden scars, he was a protector, a friend, a part of something. Soft footfalls approached. Rutherford Sloan, the traveling salesman, cleared his throat. Mr. Stone, ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. We, wanted to say goodbye. We're heading out on the next stage. Finchley, his partner, stood beside him. Don't think we'll forget this place anytime soon, Finchley added, offering a weak grin. You folks have real grit. Elijah mustered a faint smile. Safe travels, you two. Might want to stay clear of any more frontier trouble. Sloan chuckled. We'll try. Listen, if you ever come east, look us up. We'd be honored to buy you a drink. With that, the pair tipped their hats and meandered off, collecting battered luggage. Georgia nodded to Elijah. The stage schedule resumes tomorrow, I suppose, if you feel up to driving. Elijah glanced at the ruined yard, the bullet-riddled coach partially hidden behind crates. Repairs would be needed, new horses possibly purchased, harnesses replaced. But a glint of determination lit his eyes. I'll have it ready, he said. As the midday heat deepened, folks drifted back to their own affairs, like survivors after a storm, assessing what remained of homes and hearts. A handful of ranchers gathered to bury the last outlaws, muttering that no one deserved to rot unburied, even murderers. Elaine Draper and her children tended to the small garden behind the outpost, grateful to be alive. Annie Westbrook sat at the piano, picking out a gentle melody despite the missing keys. Standing near the corral, Elijah Stone turned his gaze east, imagining the wide roads that led away from Silver Bend. For years he had run from his shadowed past. Now, for the first time, he felt free enough to linger. A faint breeze ruffled his hair. The hush in his mind, once reminiscent of funeral marches, had softened into the quiet warmth of belonging. He patted one of the horses, letting it nuzzle his bandaged arm. Guess we'll keep driving, old girl, he murmured. There's more to do here than anywhere else. The horse snorted in agreement, or perhaps just sought a lump of sugar. Elijah smiled, stepping away to join Georgia in finalizing the upcoming route. He might still have restless nights, haunted by old ghosts and fresh losses, but a renewed purpose anchored him. He wasn't just a lonely gun anymore. He was Elijah Stone, stage driver for Silver Bend, ready to face each sunrise with quiet determination, proof that even a man once known for violence could find peace and might even be its fiercest defender. As the gun smoke clears over Copper Creek, a newfound peace settles where violence once threatened to tear a community apart. Sam Kincaid, the legendary gunfighter turned humble stage driver, reminds us all what true American heroism looks like. Not just a quick draw, but strength tempered by mercy, courage refined by wisdom. Today, the town discovered something worth more than gold, the unbreakable bond of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, protecting their homes and loved ones against impossible odds. It's a story worthy of John Wayne and the golden age of Westerns, a testament to bravery, resilience, and redemption. Now it's your turn. What did you think about Sam's incredible showdown? Could you imagine yourself standing alongside him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss this unforgettable Western tale. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and stay tuned for more thrilling stories. Because